Most people think growth comes from adding more. More comfort. More options. More security. But growth begins the moment the self dares to release. Because what you refuse to sacrifice eventually sacrifices you. In Iqbal's philosophy of Khudi, advancement does not come from accumulation. It comes from sacrifice. Sacrifice concentrates energy, clarifies direction, and transforms desire into destiny. What the self releases no longer controls it. Today we move deeper into Khudi, The Secret of the Self by Allama Iqbal. In this episode, Iqbal teaches a difficult truth. The self grows, not by keeping everything, but by choosing what truly deserves its life energy. This is episode 31. Stay with the weight of conscious sacrifice. The self does not grow only by acquiring. It grows by releasing. What is held without purpose becomes weight without meaning. The self often confuses accumulation with advancement. Possession creates illusion of progress. But progress requires direction. Direction demands choice. Choice demands sacrifice. Every meaningful choice closes paths. Paths left open pull energy. Energy divided weakens becoming. Energy focused deepens form. The self must let go of certain comforts to preserve integrity. Comfort retained without scrutiny dissolves resolve. Sacrifice is not loss. When chosen consciously, it is investment. Investment excludes alternatives. Exclusion clarifies commitment. The self that refuses sacrifice chooses delay. Delay feels safe, but delayed becoming accumulates regret. Regret weighs heavier than sacrifice. The self learns that sacrifice sharpens intention. What is surrendered highlights value. Value chosen stabilizes identity. Sacrifice reveals seriousness. Casual desire avoids cost. Serious desire prepares payment. Payment made strengthens authority. The self cannot advance while holding opposites with equal grip. Opposites cancel force. Force clarified demands release. Sacrifice teaches hierarchy of values. Without hierarchy, everything competes. Competition confuses will. Will confused exhausts strength. The self begins to see that sacrifice protects against distraction. Distraction flatters novelty. Novelty fragments effort. Fragmented effort stagnates. Sacrifice restrains impulse. Impulse seeks immediate relief. Relief gained cheaply demands future cost. Sacrifice pays upfront. The self understands that sacrifice transforms fear. Fear of loss becomes fear of stagnation. Stagnation acknowledged motivates release. The self must relinquish false identities. Roles played for acceptance consume energy. Energy reclaimed builds authenticity. Authenticity stabilizes presence. Sacrifice dismantles entitlement. Entitlement expects reward without surrender. Surrender embraced reforms merit. Merit earned sustains dignity. The self notices. That sacrifice deepens patience. Waiting becomes meaningful when direction is chosen. Direction chosen tolerates delay. Sacrifice defines edges. Edges give shape. Shape gives weight. Weight grounds existence. The self that avoids sacrifice collects options endlessly. Options unchosen weaken commitment. Commitment deferred dissipates authority. The self learns. That sacrifice filters illusions. Illusions resist cost. Reality withstands payment. What survives sacrifice deserves endurance. The self stops negotiating endlessly. Negotiation postpones action. Sacrifice commits. Commitment organizes life. Sacrifice is required. Not because life is cruel, but because energy is finite. What is finite must be allocated. Allocation defines destiny the self realizes. That sacrifice is courage applied to desire. Desire guided by courage matures. Unguided desire scatters. The self experiences. That sacrifice simplifies complexity. Complexity burdens. Simplified direction strengthens motion. Sacrifice transforms ambition. Ambition unchecked consumes meaning. Ambition refined concentrates effort. Concentrated effort yields depth. The self learns. That sacrifice is evidence of belief. Belief untested remains thought. Belief enacted through sacrifice becomes conviction. Conviction anchors Khudi. The self that embraces sacrifice moves slower outwardly, but moves decisively inwardly. Inner decisiveness guides life reliably. Sacrifice builds trust with the future. Future responds to reliability. Reliability emerges through exclusion of excess. The self understands. That sacrifice is not punishment. It is coherence enforced gently. Coherence stabilizes being. The self begins to feel lighter after release. Release eliminates noise. Noise removed reveals signal. Signal guides growth. What the self releases voluntarily cannot enslave it later. Unreleased attachments gain power. Power surrendered returns as regret. The self recognizes. That sacrifice teaches ownership. Ownership of consequence. Ownership of direction. Ownership of becoming. The self begins to understand. That sacrifice is not subtraction. It is definition. What remains after sacrifice reveals essence. The self learns. That choice gains meaning only when alternatives are abandoned. Unabandoned alternatives whisper doubt. Doubt erodes resolve. Resolve requires closure. The self that fears sacrifice often fears clarity. Clarity removes excuses. Excuses provide comfort. Comfort delays becoming. Sacrifice trains the self to tolerate absence. Absence clarifies priority. Priority stabilizes effort. Effort sustained builds form. The self discovers that sacrifice strengthens character quietly. Quiet strength does not announce itself. Announcement attracts distraction. Distraction fragments purpose. The self accepts that sacrifice eliminates contradiction. Contradiction drains energy. Energy unified intensifies action. Intensified action reshapes trajectory. The self notices that sacrifice restores sovereignty. Sovereignty lost to impulse returns through restraint. Restraint chosen builds dignity. The self learns that sacrifice demands foresight. Foresight calculates consequence. Consequence honored prevents backlash. Backlash avoided preserves momentum. Sacrifice reveals internal order. Order emerges when values are ranked. Ranked values reduce conflict. Reduced conflict clarifies direction. The self understands that sacrifice is continuous. Old attachments loosen. New attachments tempt. Temptation requires discernment renewed. The self that sacrifices wisely does not chase novelty. Novelty fades. Aligned effort compounds. Sacrifice teaches the self that growth is selective. Not everything deserves continuation. Continuation discerning prevents dilution. The self observes that sacrifice dismantles identity inflation. Inflation exaggerates self-importance. Self-importance resists feedback. Feedback ignored invites collapse. The self learns that sacrifice creates resilience. Resilience feels like solidity. Solidity absorbs pressure. Pressure without solidity fractures. The self understands that sacrifice humbles ambition. Ambition inflated consumes clarity. Clarified ambition serves meaning. Meaning moderates pace. The self recognizes that sacrifice stabilizes decision-making. Decisions made once reduce vacillation. Vacillation exhausts will. Will stabilized conserves vitality. Sacrifice reveals what the self is willing to suffer for. Suffering avoided cheapens value. Suffering chosen dignifies cause. The self grasps that sacrifice refines the sense of enough. Enough prevents endless chasing. Chasing without end exhausts identity. The self that sacrifices intentionally accepts limitation gracefully. Limitation embraced increases freedom. Freedom expressed meaningfully matures. The self learns that sacrifice is an act of respect toward reality. Reality resists indulgence. Respect gained earns cooperation. Sacrifice reorganizes time. Time reclaimed from distraction flows into skill. Skill deepened creates mastery. Mastery builds legacy. The self understands that sacrifice prepares vision. Vision without sacrifice is fantasy. Fantasy collapses under effort. Effort sustained validates vision. The self notices that sacrifice reduces comparison. Comparison stolen from attention. Attention restored strengthens craft. The self accepts that sacrifice brings loneliness initially. Loneliness sheds false witnesses. True alignment survives scrutiny. The self begins to sense composure emerging. Composure indicates alignment. Alignment sustains endurance. Sacrifice teaches the self that loss felt early prevents larger loss later. Preventive sacrifice is wisdom. Wisdom stabilizes outcome. The self understands that sacrifice trains obedience to purpose. Purpose obeyed consistently reshapes life architecture. The self learns that sacrifice refines joy. Joy without sacrifice decays. Joy earned sustains meaning. Meaning outlives pleasure. The self experiences that sacrifice produces authority. Authority unclaimed radiates quietly. Quiet authority influences deeply. The self starts to move without hesitation. Hesitation thrives where alternatives remain active. Alternatives closed free motion. The self recognizes that sacrifice is a declaration. A declaration of seriousness. Seriousness attracts reality's cooperation. There comes a moment when the self understands that sacrifice was never deprivation. It was direction. Direction enforced by choice. The self realizes that what was surrendered no longer commands energy. Energy reclaimed fuels becoming. Becoming clarifies existence. The self no longer measures loss by what could have been. It measures alignment by what now flows effortlessly. Effort aligned feels lighter. The self understands that sacrifice removes ambiguity. Ambiguity drains resolve. Resolve clarified concentrates power. The self learns that sacrifice anchors the self in time. Time without sacrifice scatters. Scattered time erodes legacy. Anchored time builds continuity. The self accepts that sacrifice educates patience. Patience cultivates endurance. Endurance preserves commitment. The self recognizes that sacrifice stabilizes self-respect. Self-respect erodes under indulgence. Indulgence multiplied collapses dignity. Sacrifice restores it. The self understands that sacrifice fosters humility. Humility prepares learning. Learning sharpens judgment. Judgment refines action. The self sees. That sacrifice distinguishes desire from calling. Calling survives cost. Desire fades when tested. What survives deserves effort. The self experiences. That sacrifice matures freedom. Freedom constrained deliberately expands expression meaningfully. Meaningful expression outlasts impulse. The self no longer hesitates. When choosing against ease. Ease seduces but drains. Chosen discipline energizes sustainably. The self understands. That sacrifice clarifies boundaries. Boundaries protect vitality. Vitality invested wisely compounds strength. The self accepts. That sacrifice awakens courage. Courage confirms priority. Priority stabilizes destiny. The self realizes. That sacrifice produces consistency. Consistency validates intention. Intention validated strengthens identity. The self understands. That sacrifice builds emotional resilience. Resilience reduces dependency. Dependency weakens autonomy. Autonomy expanded strengthens Khudi. The self reflects. That sacrifice required faith. Faith expressed through release gains reality. Reality responded with clarity. The self recognizes. That sacrifice slowed life externally, but accelerated it internally. Internal acceleration outpaces appearances. Appearances fade. Internal form endures. The self senses. That sacrifice made life narrower, yet deeper. Depth outvalues breadth. Breadth without depth exhausts purpose. The self understands. That sacrifice upgraded seriousness. Seriousness attracts consequence. Consequence embraced matures character. The self no longer regrets what was given up. Regret implies doubt. Doubt dissolved through alignment. The self concludes finally. Sacrifice was not pain endured. It was coherence achieved. And through coherence, the self advanced into a life that could sustain it.